He wanted her hand and her fortune, no matter the cost. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your voices keep these mysteries alive. Now, let's uncover his scheme. No one in the quaint village of Much Dithering could recall a time when the fog hung so thick over the rose-trimmed hedgerows and cobbled lanes. Even the peacocks at the rectory had stopped shrieking, as if the mystery in the air was enough to silence nature itself. The body was discovered just past dawn, sprawled on the Turkish rug in the drawing-room of Westerly Hall. Major Philip Arlingham, a man both pompous and impossibly dull, was found slumped in his leather armchair, a teacup shattered at his feet, and a look of eternal astonishment carved into his features. The room was locked from the inside. The only key had been in the dead man's breast pocket. The only window, tall, narrow, and latticed, was latched and barred from within. No sign of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, not even a single footprint in the thick Persian dust near the fireplace. It was, as Inspector Craddock muttered with a grimace, an impossible damn crime. And yet, someone had killed Major Arlingham. Poison, it seemed, strychnine to be precise, mixed in his nightly chamomile tea. A cup brewed not by a stranger, but, as the staff confirmed, by the Major himself. The only other person said to have entered the drawing-room that night was his ward and stepdaughter, Miss Lorna Arlingham. Lorna had knocked gently, left a folded note on the tray for the Major, and walked away. Or so she claimed. She had no motive, no past criminal record, no opportunity unless the laws of physics had gently bent themselves for her benefit. Miss Marple was in Much Dithering that week, staying with her cousin Millicent at the vicarage after a bout of bronchitis. She hadn't meant to get involved, but when a locked-room mystery took root in a quiet English village, it might as well have sent an engraved invitation to St. Mary Mead. Poison is a personal thing, she mused softly as she stood with Inspector Craddock beside the corpse that afternoon. It requires planning, trust, and a great deal of observation. This was not a crime of impulse. Craddock, familiar with Miss Marple's deductive quirks, said nothing. He merely rubbed his temples and gave her room to observe. The drawing-room was full of peculiarities. A scratched sideboard, a knocked-over vase, though not broken, an ink stain on the sleeve of the Major's dressing gown, and the note Lorna had left. "I'll be out for a walk. We can talk after dinner." Too ordinary to be sinister, and yet too perfect. Interviews followed. Lorna, pale and graceful, denied everything. She had been out walking along the river bank, hoping to avoid another one of her stepfather's lectures about her unmarried condition. The staff adored her, particularly the cook, who gushed about how kind Lorna was even to the mice in the scullery. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Kindness is often confused with innocence, Inspector," she whispered. Next came Mr. Edward Teddy Harrowby, Major Arlingham's solicitor and an old family friend. He'd arrived at the hall only the day before, claiming to finalize some routine paperwork. Miss Marple took a moment with him in the garden. "You must be terribly busy, Mr. Harrowby. Always the executor, never the heir." He chuckled too quickly. "It's a living, Miss Marple. Some of us weren't born with estates and bloodhounds." "And some of us marry rather quickly after funerals," she murmured. He stiffened. What Miss Marple did not yet say, but quietly suspected, was that Harrowby had been courting Lorna, or rather, laying the groundwork. She had caught a brief look pass between them over breakfast, that look of wary complicity, not affection. Back inside, she asked to see the tea set. A simple service. 2 matching cups, 1 used, 1 clean. The clean one was slightly off color. A replacement. The Major had always been fastidious about his things. A query to the maid confirmed it. The original matching cup had broken weeks ago, and Teddy Harrowby had very kindly bought a replacement. The clue was subtle but troubling. Strychnine was not the sort of poison one found easily, especially not in rural England during peacetime. But Mr. Harrowby had studied abroad. He had once worked in colonial Burma, hadn't he? And among its many exports had been rare poisons, found in native plants and powdered in apothecaries. What Miss Marple couldn't yet reconcile was the how. The room had been locked, the tea brewed by the Major himself, and Lorna. Was Lorna just a pawn, or something else entirely? Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched as she reviewed the facts. A broken teacup, a scratched sideboard, a note left in plain sight. A man who brewed his own tea, who always added 2 spoonfuls of honey and 1 of lemon. The lemon. She stood up, heart racing. Not with fear, but with the familiar flutter of logic snapping into place. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the hall and asked to see the kitchen. She requested to inspect the lemon pot. It was empty, recently cleaned. Too recently. She asked the cook if any lemons had been used that evening. "Oh yes, miss. Major always has a slice. I cut one for him at about 7. Teddy Harrowby brought it in to him." There it was. The delivery of the poison, not in the tea, not in the sugar. In the lemon peel, zested with precision, steeped in a tincture of strychnine and inserted into the cup by someone who had just enough access. And then, the staging, the locked door, the note from Lorna, the innocence of a girl who was meant to appear as both suspect and scapegoat. A classic double blind. Miss Marple called for Inspector Craddock. "You'll find his fingerprints on the lemon knife," she said calmly. "And if you search Mr. Harrowby's room, I expect you'll find traces of the powder he thought would dissolve too neatly down the drain." Craddock blinked. But why go to all this trouble? "Because," Miss Marple sighed, "he wanted to marry Lorna, but not as a penniless solicitor. He needed the inheritance, and he knew the only obstacle was a stepfather with an inconvenient fondness for control." It took less than a day for Craddock's team to find the evidence. Harrowby broke down in the library, his composure unraveling, not from guilt, but the humiliation of being caught by an old lady with a penchant for knitting. And Lorna? She was cleared. Though visibly shaken, she recovered quickly, inheriting the estate and choosing wisely to leave Westerly Hall behind. Miss Marple, however, stayed a few more days. There was knitting to finish and fog to watch, and in the soft silence of an August evening, she sipped her tea with no lemon at all. "One should always be careful," she said to no one in particular, especially around men who are eager to play both guardian and groom. It was 3 days after the arrest when Miss Marple's curiosity stirred again, not with a dramatic revelation this time, but with a whisper of something amiss. The village had resumed its quiet rhythm, the scandal wrapped up too neatly for her liking. Inspector Craddock had thanked her profusely, the papers had run a modest article on her role, and Westerly Hall had begun preparations for Lorna's departure. And yet there it was, an itch in the back of her mind, persistent and uninvited. It began with the clock. Not the grandfather clock in the hallway, but the small carriage clock on the mantelpiece in the drawing-room. Miss Marple had remembered it precisely because it had chimed once when she stood examining the broken teacup. It had struck a soft, clear note at what must have been close to 7:15 p.m., the supposed time of Major Arlingham's tea. But in her final visit to the room after Harrowby's arrest, the same clock was 12 minutes slow, not fast, not erratic, precisely 12 minutes behind. And unlike most mechanical clocks that falter in steps, this one was known to be remarkably steady. Major Arlingham had it cleaned every 3 months, and once famously chastised the vicar for being late by 3 minutes during a garden tea. Had someone adjusted it? But why? A subtle unease returned. Something wasn't adding up. She began to retrace the days. Not the crime, but the people. Lorna Arlingham, for instance, had accepted the explanation of Harrowby's guilt with an odd degree of calm. Not detachment, exactly, but a kind of quiet resignation. At the time, it seemed like shock, grief, perhaps. But now Miss Marple wondered. Was it relief or satisfaction? She hadn't seen Lorna since the arrest. Most assumed she was mourning or preparing for her move to London. But when Miss Marple asked Millicent's housemaid to deliver a note, she was informed that Miss Arlingham had taken to long, solitary rides on horseback each morning, and that she often returned flushed, bright-eyed, not weighed by loss, but energized. Curious, indeed. Miss Marple requested tea with her that very afternoon. Lorna, dressed in muted grey silk, received her graciously in the conservatory. "It's very kind of you to visit, Miss Marple," she said with a smile too composed. "I imagine the village is still buzzing." "Less than one would expect," Miss Marple replied, settling into a wicker chair. "Though I must admit, I've been thinking about your stepfather's watchfulness. He seemed quite the creature of habit." Lorna tilted her head slightly. "Wary." "He was. To a fault, really." "And yet," Miss Marple continued, pouring herself a modest cup of tea, "someone tampered with his habits in the most peculiar way. Tell me, did he ever let the mantel clock run slow?" Lorna blinked. "I don't think so. He was obsessed with punctuality. But I hadn't noticed." "That's the trouble," Miss Marple said gently. "Most people wouldn't." There was a pause. Lorna sipped her tea, her fingers perfectly still. Too still. "I imagine it could have been Teddy," she said softly. "Perhaps he adjusted it to confuse the timeline." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She let the moment hang, studying the girl's reaction. "But why bother?" she finally said. "Why not simply poison the tea, let the body be found, and allow the evidence to speak for itself?" Lorna set her cup down with a faint clink. Perhaps he wanted to create a false time of death, to make his own alibi stronger. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps. But she knew now what her instinct had begun whispering. The story was too smooth, too neatly resolved. Teddy Harrowby had been set up, not wholly innocent perhaps, but not the primary architect of the crime. His mistake was timing. He had helped, but someone else had orchestrated. Back in the vicarage study, Miss Marple pulled out the local paper and began rereading the reports. Something stood out this time. A brief mention of the Major's will, amended a month before his death. It named Lorna as sole beneficiary of Westerly Hall and its considerable assets. Teddy Harrowby was merely listed as financial overseer until such time as Miss Arlingham came of age. Lorna was 20, but the inheritance would not come fully to her unless she married, or reached 21. Miss Marple folded the paper, eyes sharp with focus. The clause was unusual, but not unheard of. That made Harrowby's interest in Lorna make sense, but also made Lorna's position complicated. The stepfather held all the keys, financial, social, personal, and if he disapproved of a suitor, he had the legal right to withhold control of the estate until her next birthday, unless he was gone, and unless someone else, someone clever, knew how to make a man drink his own poisoned tea with a slice of death-laced lemon, then adjust the clock to falsely reflect an earlier time of death, giving her an airtight alibi of being out walking during the crime. Miss Marple's next visit was to Inspector Craddock. She asked to review the list of items taken from the crime scene. "What I'm looking for," she explained, "is not what was found, but what was missing." Craddock, still trusting her intuition, complied. Together they went over the records: cup, tray, note, robe, pocket watch, house key. But something was wrong. "The tray," Miss Marple said. "Did anyone confirm it was the same tray Lorna brought in?" Craddock frowned. "I don't believe so. It's the standard silver one used in the evening. Why? It was changed, she said quietly. You see, the tray she brought had a small nick on the side. I remember it from the morning after. But when I last saw the tray, there was no such mark, meaning someone replaced it after the body was found, and likely before the police arrived. Craddock stared at her. Why would she switch the tray? Because, Miss Marple said, she needed to hide something that didn't fit her story. Perhaps a drop of tea where there shouldn't have been one, or a second note. They ordered a discreet search of the kitchen refuse. By a stroke of luck, or the justice of persistence, a scorched paper was found deep in the ash pile behind the cookhouse. It had been half burned, buried beneath kitchen scraps. Under careful restoration, one phrase was still legible. If you breathe a word, I'll see you penniless and ruined. St. Pierre Major Philip Arlingham. Miss Marple closed her eyes. That was the final piece. The first note, the pleasant one left on the tray, had been planted. This second note, the real one, had been destroyed. And the tone was not that of a worried guardian, but of a man with something to hold over his ward. Now, the motive was clearer than ever. Miss Marple opened her eyes. Inspector, she said calmly, I believe you arrested the wrong person, and I'm afraid Miss Arlingham has a rather longer ride ahead of her than she expected. The next morning, under a pale sun that barely warmed the hedgerows, Inspector Craddock returned to Westerly Hall with Miss Marple beside him, her face as mild and unassuming as ever. The scent of cut grass mixed with the fainter, sour trace of damp ash from the cookhouse where the scorched note had been found. By now, the village believed the case was closed. Teddy Harrowby remained under arrest in Dorchester, awaiting formal charges. But Craddock was beginning to feel the discomfort of premature satisfaction, the kind that comes before the full rot is revealed beneath polished wood. We'll need to speak with them again, Miss Marple said gently. Not as they were, with their neat rehearsals and innocent expressions, but now, when they believe the performance is over. Craddock agreed. The first to be called was Alice, the housemaid. She arrived with her apron freshly pressed, nervously clutching her hands. She had been the one to prepare the bedroom on the night of the murder and claimed to have seen nothing unusual. Craddock gave her a kindly nod. Alice, I want you to think carefully. When you cleaned the drawing room that night, was anything different? Alice looked confused. No, sir. Everything was like always, except, well... She hesitated, eyes darting to Miss Marple. Yes, Miss Marple encouraged, her tone light. It's just... Alice wrung her fingers. There were 2 cups on the tray, not one. Later, I saw only one in the police photographs. I thought maybe I was wrong. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Were both used? One was. The other was clean, but it had been there. I remember because the handle was chipped. A tiny flaw like a bite taken out of it. Craddock's brow furrowed. That cup had never been catalogued. Thank you, Alice. That's very helpful. As the girl was dismissed, Miss Marple whispered, another cup. Replaced or hidden. A second drinker or a staged appearance of one. Either way, deception. Next came the butler, Simmons. Ever solemn, Simmons had served the family for 20 years and claimed complete loyalty to Major Arlingham. Simmons, Craddock began, do you recall who last saw Mr. Harrowby before the Major's death? I believe he retired early, sir. Went to his room after dinner. I brought him a whiskey. He said he had a headache. Miss Marple interjected. And did he seem distressed? Frightened? Simmons' eyelid twitched. I wouldn't say frightened. Just tight-lipped, preoccupied. He asked about the post, whether anything had arrived from London. Did it? No, ma'am, only a parcel for Miss Arlingham. That prompted a subtle look between Craddock and Miss Marple. What was in it? Craddock asked. Simmons paused. I'm not sure. Miss Arlingham took it herself. Craddock wrote something in his notebook, but Miss Marple was already pulling at the thread. And how did she seem that evening? Simmons hesitated, but something in her tone loosened his guard. Cold, not impolite, but resolved, as though she had decided something she didn't like but would carry out all the same. They thanked him and moved on. The next to be called was Mrs. Ellerton, the cook, plump, red-cheeked, and overly eager. She bustled in with a clatter of beads around her neck and offered tea before sitting. "Terrible business, truly," she said before anyone could speak. "Still don't know how Mr. Harrowby could do such a thing. He always tipped generously." "You seemed fond of Miss Arlingham," Miss Marple noted. "Oh, I am," Mrs. Ellerton beamed. "Such a dear. Never too proud to help in the kitchen. Why, just last week she helped me peel potatoes after I slipped on the step." "Was that before or after the parcel from London?" The cook blinked. "Parcel? Delivered the night of the murder." Mrs. Ellerton's brow furrowed. "I didn't know about any parcel." A crack, a contradiction. "Odd," Craddock murmured. "Simmons said it was given directly to Miss Arlingham." Mrs. Ellerton looked flustered. "Oh, well, perhaps it came while I was out. I did go to visit my sister in the afternoon." "Alice said you never left that day," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Ellerton's eyes darted. "Well, perhaps I'm mistaken." Miss Marple and Craddock exchanged a glance. She was lying, but why? The final conversation that afternoon was with Lorna herself. She met them in the old study, sunlight spilling across the floor in clean gold rectangles. She appeared calm, poised, almost radiant. "I was told you had more questions," she said, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Yes, Miss Arlingham," Craddock said. "You received a parcel the night your stepfather died. What was in it?" "A dress," she replied smoothly. "A pale blue one I ordered from London for my birthday." "May we see it?" She hesitated, only briefly. "Of course." They followed her to her bedroom. She opened the wardrobe and pulled out a folded garment. Pale blue chiffon, unworn, still creased from the box. Miss Marple examined it briefly. "Lovely. But tell me, did it come with gloves?" Lorna blinked. "Gloves? No, only the dress." Miss Marple smiled. "Strange. It's standard for that shop to include silk gloves with such orders. A small gesture. Unless the contents were changed." Craddock turned toward Lorna. "We found evidence of a second note, Miss Arlingham. A threatening one from your stepfather. Burned after his death." Her lips parted slightly. "He wrote me many notes, Inspector. But not all of them pleasant," Miss Marple added. "We also know there was a second teacup on the tray, possibly yours, and a parcel whose contents may not have been a dress at all." For the first time, Lorna's composure cracked. A flicker of panic darted across her eyes before she buried it. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "you knew exactly what your stepfather was planning. You didn't intend to kill him at first. Perhaps you wanted to scare him or blackmail him back, but it escalated. Poison was your answer." Lorna's hands trembled. "You have no proof?" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not yet. But the voices around you contradict one another. And buried in those contradictions is a truth, one you can no longer hide." Craddock's voice was firm. "We'll reopen the case, have the parcel traced, and question Harrowby again, this time with what we know now." As Lorna sat in silence, something in her elegant mask slipped. Not guilt, not quite, but fear. The deception was beginning to unravel, and in the shifting stories and scattered lies, the truth was finally clawing its way to the surface. Outside Westerly Hall, the air had grown cooler, and with it came a clarity that often followed the storm. Inside, however, the storm still raged. Quiet now, a storm of silence, but no less dangerous for its lack of thunder. The pieces were all on the board: a dead man, a poisoned drink, a destroyed note, a tampered clock, and a tray that had vanished and reappeared like a magician's coin. And yet, even with all this, the final picture refused to take shape. Inspector Craddock, seated at the vicarage study table beside Miss Marple, tapped his pencil against a stack of conflicting witness statements. "Every time we close one thread," he muttered, "another bloody one unravels. They all had reason, but the story keeps shifting." Miss Marple, her knitting untouched in her lap, stared thoughtfully at the window. "That's because you're looking for a single motive, Inspector. But crimes like this, crimes committed by clever people under pressure, are rarely so tidy. Sometimes—" she paused. "Sometimes it's not one motive at all. It's several, braided together so tightly they become indistinguishable until you pull them apart, one by one." They began with Harrowby. On paper, his motive was the clearest. Financial. He was in debt, gambled away a small inheritance 2 years prior, and though he had masked it with charm and borrowed respectability, the pressure was growing. Miss Marple recalled the too eager way he had offered to help with the estate, the timing of his visit just as the Major's new will took effect, and of course his pursuit of Lorna, not purely romantic, but calculated. If he married her before she came into her inheritance, he would legally have control of it. "But then," Craddock said, flipping through the will's annotations, "if he stood to gain so much, why act so early? He only needed to wait a few more months, until Lorna turned 21. Miss Marple nodded. "Which is why I believe Harrowby did not plan the murder. He merely intended to manipulate it, to gain from it once it occurred. But someone else acted first. Lorna. Her motives were murkier. At first glance, she appeared a victim, trapped under her stepfather's thumb, possibly emotionally abused, if the burned letter was any indication. But the deeper one looked, the more the threads twisted. She had motive not just to escape, but to win. The clause in the will was crucial. If she married, she could take full control of the estate immediately. And there had been rumors, overheard by Alice the maid, of a secret engagement, not to Harrowby, but to a young painter in London. A man without means, unsuitable by the Major's standards. Miss Marple remembered Alice mentioning a torn photograph hidden in Lorna's desk drawer. Half of a couple, one side missing. Jealousy and control, then. Perhaps the Major had discovered the affair. Perhaps that was what the burned letter had threatened to expose. But where did Mrs. Ellerton, the cook, fit into the web? Her eagerness to cooperate had stood out from the beginning. Too eager, especially when the parcel had been mentioned. Miss Marple had not forgotten the flash of confusion in her eyes. Genuine surprise, not the calculated stalling of someone trying to lie. And so Miss Marple paid her a quiet visit. In the narrow, warm kitchen, the smell of bread and wood smoke clung to the walls. Mrs. Ellerton bustled nervously at the stove. "You were very loyal to Miss Arlingham," Miss Marple began casually. "Oh, yes," she said quickly. "She's always been kind to me." "Almost like a daughter?" The cook stopped stirring. "I suppose so, yes." "She reminded you of someone?" Mrs. Ellerton hesitated. Then her voice dropped. "I had a niece. She died young. Took ill working in service. Far from home. Miss Arlingham, she had the same eyes." "You would do anything to protect her," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Ellerton's jaw clenched. "I believe you intercepted that parcel," Miss Marple continued. "It wasn't just a dress. It was something else. Perhaps gloves, perhaps a small vial. Something Lorna had ordered, and you removed it, trying to shield her, but you didn't destroy it. You hid it, am I right?" The cook didn't answer. But her eyes gave her away. Later, Miss Marple searched the back pantry with Craddock and found a hidden drawer beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a delicate silk glove, stained faintly with a pale yellow dust, possibly strychnine, and a handwritten note addressed to Lorna in a man's hand. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched a signature on a guest book from a London gallery. The painter. Back at the vicarage, Craddock paced the floor. So she was planning to elope? Poison her stepfather, claim the inheritance, and marry in secret? Perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps the plan wasn't hers alone. Perhaps she was persuaded. Craddock turned. By Harrowby? No, Miss Marple said, eyes narrowing. By someone who loved her, romantically or maternally. Someone who feared what might happen if the Major discovered her secret. Someone who believed they were protecting her. The implication hung heavy in the air. The following morning, Harrowby was questioned again. Presented with the glove and note, he looked genuinely puzzled. That's not my handwriting, he said, frowning. She told me she wasn't seeing anyone else. I didn't know about this painter. Miss Marple studied his face carefully. There was no flicker of recognition. You were trying to pressure her into marriage, weren't you? She asked. His jaw clenched. Yes, I thought it was the only way to fix everything. But you didn't kill her stepfather. I couldn't have, I swear it. I was angry. But not a killer. Miss Marple believed him. At last. That afternoon she returned to the hall alone, walking the ivy-covered path in quiet thought. The motive web had begun to clear. Lorna was at the center, but she had not acted alone. She had accomplices. Not because she asked for them, but because she was adored by people desperate to free her from the cage of the Major's control. Each played a part. Harrowby had brought the lemon. The cook had hidden the parcel. And Lorna herself. Perhaps she simply allowed it all to unfold. Perhaps she merely opened the door and stepped aside as the poison slipped into the tea. Greed, love, fear, protection. No single motive drove the crime. But together, they created the perfect storm. And in the heart of it stood a young woman who had mastered the art of letting others commit her sins for her. Outside Westerly Hall, the air had grown cooler, and with it came a clarity that often followed the storm. Inside, however, the storm still raged, quiet now, a storm of silence, but no less dangerous for its lack of thunder. The pieces were all on the board, a dead man, a poisoned drink, a destroyed note, a tampered clock, and a tray that had vanished and reappeared like a magician's coin. And yet, even with all this, the final picture refused to take shape. Inspector Craddock, seated at the vicarage study table beside Miss Marple, tapped his pencil against a stack of conflicting witness statements. Every time we close one thread, he muttered, another bloody one unravels. They all had reason, but the story keeps shifting. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched in her lap, stared thoughtfully at the window. That's because you're looking for a single motive, Inspector. But crimes like this, crimes committed by clever people under pressure, are rarely so tidy. Sometimes, she paused. Sometimes it's not one motive at all. It's several, braided together so tightly they become indistinguishable until you pull them apart, one by one. They began with Harrowby. On paper, his motive was the clearest. Financial. He was in debt, gambled away a small inheritance 2 years prior, and though he had masked it with charm and borrowed respectability, the pressure was growing. Miss Marple recalled the too eager way he had offered to help with the estate, the timing of his visit just as the Major's new will took effect. And of course, his pursuit of Lorna. Not purely romantic, but calculated. If he married her before she came into her inheritance, he would legally have control of it. But then, Craddock said, flipping through the will's annotations, if he stood to gain so much, why act so early? He only needed to wait a few more months, until Lorna turned 21. Miss Marple nodded. Which is why I believe Harrowby did not plan the murder. He merely intended to manipulate it, to gain from it once it occurred. But someone else acted first. Lorna. Her motives were murkier. At first glance, she appeared a victim, trapped under her stepfather's thumb, possibly emotionally abused if the burned letter was any indication. But the deeper one looked, the more the threads twisted. She had motive not just to escape, but to win. The clause in the will was crucial. If she married, she could take full control of the estate immediately. And there had been rumors, overheard by Alice the maid, of a secret engagement, not to Harrowby, but to a young painter in London, a man without means, unsuitable by the major standards. Miss Marple remembered Alice mentioning a torn photograph hidden in Lorna's desk drawer. Half of a couple, one side missing. Jealousy and control, then. Perhaps the Major had discovered the affair. Perhaps that was what the burned letter had threatened to expose. But where did Mrs. Ellerton, the cook, fit into the web? Her eagerness to cooperate had stood out from the beginning, too eager, especially when the parcel had been mentioned. Miss Marple had not forgotten the flash of confusion in her eyes. Genuine surprise, not the calculated stalling of someone trying to lie. And so Miss Marple paid her a quiet visit. In the narrow, warm kitchen, the smell of bread and wood smoke clung to the walls. Mrs. Ellerton bustled nervously at the stove. "You were very loyal to Miss Arlingham," Miss Marple began casually. "Oh, yes," she said quickly. "She's always been kind to me. Almost like a daughter." The cook stopped stirring. "I suppose so, yes." "She reminded you of someone?" Mrs. Ellerton hesitated. Then her voice dropped. "I had a niece. She died young, took ill working in service, far from home. Miss Arlingham. She had the same eyes. You would do anything to protect her," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Ellerton's jaw clenched. "I believe you intercepted that parcel," Miss Marple continued. "It wasn't just a dress. It was something else. Perhaps gloves, perhaps a small vial. Something Lorna had ordered. And you removed it, trying to shield her. But you didn't destroy it. You hid it, am I right?" The cook didn't answer, but her eyes gave her away. Later, Miss Marple searched the back pantry with Craddock and found a hidden drawer beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a delicate silk glove, stained faintly with a pale yellow dust, possibly strychnine, and a handwritten note addressed to Lorna in a man's hand. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched a signature on a guest book from a London gallery. The painter. Back at the vicarage, Craddock paced the floor. So she was planning to elope, poison her stepfather, claim the inheritance, and marry in secret? Perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps the plan wasn't hers alone. Perhaps she was persuaded. Craddock turned. By Harrowby? No, Miss Marple said, eyes narrowing. By someone who loved her, romantically or maternally. Someone who feared what might happen if the Major discovered her secret. Someone who believed they were protecting her. The implication hung heavy in the air. The following morning, Harrowby was questioned again. Presented with the glove and note, he looked genuinely puzzled. "That's not my handwriting," he said, frowning. "She told me she wasn't seeing anyone else. I didn't know about this painter." Miss Marple studied his face carefully. There was no flicker of recognition. "You were trying to pressure her into marriage, weren't you?" she asked. His jaw clenched. "Yes. I thought it was the only way to fix everything. But you didn't kill her stepfather." "I couldn't have. I swear it. I was angry, but not a killer." Miss Marple believed him, some at last. That afternoon she returned to the hall alone, walking the ivy-covered path in quiet thought. The motive web had begun to clear. Lorna was at the center, but she had not acted alone. She had accomplices, not because she asked for them, but because she was adored by people desperate to free her from the cage of the Major's control. Each played a part. Harrowby had brought the lemon. The cook had hidden the parcel. And Lorna herself. Perhaps she simply allowed it all to unfold. Perhaps she merely opened the door and stepped aside as the poison slipped into the tea. Greed, love, fear, protection. No single motive drove the crime, but together they created the perfect storm. And in the heart of it, stood a young woman who had mastered the art of letting others commit her sins for her. The rain came hard that night, beating the cobbled lanes of much dithering into glistening streams, and Westerly Hall stood shrouded in water-slicked ivy and silence. Inside, Inspector Craddock paced before the great hearth, while Lorna Arlingham, composed and unreadable, stood by the windows, her arms crossed as if bracing herself against some distant wind. "I've been exonerated, Inspector," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "Your arrest of Teddy Harrowby was premature. You said so yourself. Now you've found your glove, your note, and your poison, and none of them linked to me directly." It was true. The glove, discovered in the cook's pantry, bore no fingerprints. The note found inside it was untraceable, written in a non-distinct cursive style, unsigned, offering only romantic platitudes about escape and freedom. And the strychnine. It matched no registered purchase, no known import channel, and it had likely been acquired illegally years ago, undetectable now. Craddock sighed, rubbing his forehead. "No one's arresting you, Miss Arlingham? Then this is over?" He looked toward Miss Marple, who had remained seated quietly near the fire, knitting in her lap, but her needles still. Her gaze was fixed, not on Lorna, but on the fire itself, as though watching the flicker of something not quite real. "Yes," Craddock finally said, "for now." But even as the words left his mouth, a bitter taste clung to them. Because that morning, a new piece of evidence had surfaced, a discovery that had seemed, at first, to crack the case wide open. It had been Teddy Harrowby himself, during a final interview, who mentioned it. "The clock," he said, rubbing his temples. "The mantel clock in the drawing room. Philip used to check it obsessively, at least twice a day, but that night it was off, wasn't it? Slow by 12 minutes. He'd never allow that." The line wasn't new. Miss Marple had raised the same point days earlier, but what came next was, "I remember now. I heard it chime once when I passed the hallway after dinner, just after 7, and I heard Lorna in the drawing room, her voice. She was laughing." "You're sure?" Craddock had asked sharply. "I'm sure. It was a quick laugh." Then silence. If true, it meant Lorna had been in the room, long enough to prepare the tea, perhaps long enough to deliver a note, and perhaps to tamper with it. Combined with the poisoned lemon and the vanished tray, it painted a clear, clean picture, neatly damning. The authorities responded quickly. The Crown prosecutor reviewed the updated case file and, without fanfare, authorized charges against Lorna Arlingham. The evidence, though circumstantial, was enough when bound together. The altered will, the secret lover, the strained relationship with the deceased, and now a credible witness hearing her in the room at the time of death. By late afternoon, Craddock delivered the warrant. But before it could be executed, something intervened. Or rather, someone. Miss Marple. They were in the study of the vicarage once more, the fire crackling with stubborn determination against the wind outside. Craddock laid the signed documents on the desk. "We're ready," he said. "No," Miss Marple replied calmly. Craddock frowned. "What do you mean, no? The case is airtight now. You said yourself. Everything points to her." "I did, but now I no longer believe it." She rose, stepping lightly across the room to the window, the reflection of her soft face flickering in the pane. "It's too clean," she said. "Too arranged." Craddock hesitated. "You think someone wants us to believe it was Lorna?" Miss Marple turned. "Yes, someone clever, someone close. And I believe we've been guided, gently but deliberately, toward a false conclusion." She sat back down, placing her knitting aside entirely. "Let me ask you something, Inspector. Do you remember what Alice, the maid, said about the tray?" "Yes," he replied, "that she saw 2 cups originally, one with a chip." And what did we find on the tray entered into evidence? Craddock frowned. 1 cup. No chip. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. And who took the tray from the room after the body was discovered? The butler, Simmons, Craddock said. At least, that's what he told us. But Simmons wasn't present that morning, Miss Marple said. He left early to collect a delivery. It was Mrs. Ellerton who entered first and claimed to find the Major cold, but she never told us she moved the tray. Craddock blinked. You think she switched the cups? I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that someone else was in the room before Simmons arrived. Someone who planted a different tray to match a false narrative. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Who? The one person who insisted on seeing the body before anyone else, Miss Marple said. The person who claimed they were checking for signs of life and told everyone to remain outside. She paused. Lorna. The room was silent. Rain hissed against the glass. She walked in before anyone else, told Alice to fetch the doctor, told Simmons to stand aside, and in those precious 2 minutes she could have done anything. Switched trays, removed the chipped cup, tidied the scene, left only what she wanted us to find. But then why lie? Craddock asked. Why not simply say she brought the tea? Because, Miss Marple said, she wasn't supposed to. That was Harrowby's job that night. She wasn't meant to be in the drawing room until later, but something changed. Perhaps the Major summoned her. Perhaps she lost her nerve. Or perhaps she simply saw a chance to twist the knife and ensure the trail pointed away from her. Craddock looked stricken. But the laugh, Harrowby heard it. Miss Marple nodded. And that, too, is curious. He was already in custody. Why wait until now to mention it? She looked at him steadily. Perhaps he didn't remember it until someone reminded him, or perhaps he was told to say it. You think he's protecting her, or still under her thumb? He's a weak man, and she is not a woman easily dismissed, if she promised to clear his name in exchange for his silence, or if she threatened him. Craddock stared at the papers in front of him. The evidence was real. The glove, the note, the time of death, the poisoned lemon, all of it stacked against Lorna, and yet it had arrived so neatly, too neatly. False victories are dangerous, Miss Marple thought. They encourage the killer to relax, and that's when they make mistakes. We wait, she said softly. We delay the arrest. Let her think she's free, and then we watch. Because if I'm right... She looked into the fire, her eyes gleaming. The real criminal hasn't finished yet. A cold wind stirred the old trees along Much Dithering Lane as Miss Marple sat alone in the vicarage's modest sitting room, fingers resting gently on the open pages of a dusty parish register. The book crackled with age, its entries written in a faded, looping script. It wasn't the first place one would look for answers to a modern-day murder, and yet it had been her instinct to return to it. Back to the archives, back to the beginnings. She traced a line with her finger. The name leapt from the page like a ghost. Clarence Harrowby. Married Judith Ellerton. Died 1919. Her brows furrowed. Judith Ellerton, the name shared with the very woman now mourning the death of Major Philip Arlingham. But this was no coincidence, and no distant relative. The timeline fit. Judith was younger then, certainly, perhaps no more than 20 when she married. She had been widowed during the Great War, but Harrowby, that name... The pieces began to shift in her mind. Teddy Harrowby was not Philip's godson, as commonly assumed. He was Judith's son from that first marriage, and the name Clarence... Yes, it had appeared once more, weeks earlier, in a brief mumbled reference from the housekeeper, Mrs. Plum. That boy, he's nothing like his father Clarence, she had said, but Judith spoils him all the same. Miss Marple rose, the register still open. The pieces were aligning, fragments of lineage, old loyalties, and half-buried resentments threading themselves together like a tapestry being reversed to show its true pattern. At Westerly Hall later that day, the tension had changed texture. Lorna Arlingham had returned to her usual routines with unsettling ease, moving about the drawing room with poise, instructing servants with clipped civility, and speaking softly with Teddy as if the entire world hadn't collapsed just days before. Craddock joined Miss Marple near the garden path. "You've seen something," he said, recognizing the fire behind her eyes. "Yes, and it isn't in the present," she replied. "It's in the past. A past none of them wanted us to look too closely at." She explained quietly what she'd found. Clarence Harrowby, his marriage to Judith, his untimely death in 1919, and the subsequent connection to Teddy. It wasn't merely a matter of affection. Philip wasn't just a godfather to Teddy. He was effectively a stepfather. But more importantly, there's Judith. She lost a husband, then she married Philip not long after. "Convenient," Craddock muttered. "Do we know how Clarence died?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Influenza. At least that's what the records say. But I'm beginning to wonder." The inspector's brows rose. "Judith is no stranger to widowhood or convenient deaths, but here's what troubles me more. Philip Arlingham made a fortune on colonial investments. That money didn't come until the early 1920s, and according to registry data, Clarence Harrowby had a stake in a textile enterprise in India, one that failed under mysterious circumstances in 1918, just before his death. You think Judith helped engineer Clarence's death to secure Philip's fortune?" "I think it's possible," Miss Marple said. "And now that Philip's dead, history may have repeated itself." Craddock looked at the grand hall rising beyond the hedges. "You believe Judith is our killer?" "I believe Judith, Lorna, and Teddy all share secrets that go deeper than love or inheritance. But I'm not convinced Judith had the strength or cruelty to poison Philip. What I do believe is that she's hiding something from long ago." That afternoon, Craddock conducted a quiet follow-up interview with Judith Ellerton in her sitting room. Miss Marple stood nearby, knitting as usual, though her eyes never left the older woman's face. "Mrs. Ellerton," Craddock began gently, "you were married before, weren't you?" Judith stiffened. "Yes, to Clarence, many years ago. You never mentioned it during the investigation. I didn't think it was relevant. Was Philip close to your first husband?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not particularly. They were acquaintances. And yet, after Clarence died, Philip married you within a year." She gave a brittle smile. "Grief brings people together." Craddock leaned forward slightly. "Did Philip Arlingham ever discuss Clarence's death with you? Ever question the circumstances?" A long silence followed. Then, to their surprise, Judith's expression changed. Her shoulders dropped. She looked not defiant, but relieved. "Yes," she whispered. "He questioned it, but not because he thought I had done anything, because Clarence had debts. He was terrified someone might come after us, after me and Teddy. Philip made the whole thing go away. That's why I married him. He protected us." "And did anyone come after you?" "Once. A solicitor came asking about shares. Philip paid him off quietly." Miss Marple spoke now softly. "And when Philip died, did you fear the past would come back again?" Judith nodded. "Yes. That's why I was so afraid when you all started asking questions about old letters. I thought, perhaps Clarence's dealings had returned to haunt us. But I swear I didn't kill Philip." Craddock exchanged a look with Miss Marple. Judith's fear was real, but it wasn't the fear of being caught for this crime. It was the dread of having past sins dragged into daylight. Later that evening, Miss Marple and Craddock sat in the quiet hush of the vicarage again, the lamp casting a warm circle of light. "So," Craddock said, "we've uncovered a tangle of long-buried motives, a hidden first marriage, inheritance disputes, and an earlier suspicious death. But where does it point?" Miss Marple's hands paused mid-knit. "It points," she said, "to the fact that no one in Westerly Hall is telling us the full truth, and that includes Lorna and Teddy. They both had knowledge of Clarence's death. Teddy as a child who likely heard whispers, and Lorna, who studied Philip's estate so thoroughly she must have known where the money came from. And yet neither mentioned Clarence." "Convenient," Craddock muttered. "Or damning," Miss Marple said. "Because if you know how a man made his fortune by marrying a widow with a dead husband and silenced debts, then poisoning that man decades later to gain what's left of it may not feel like a crime, but an inheritance." The rain had eased by then, but the shadows in much dithering were only growing, and Miss Marple did not believe in brute confrontation, nor in cold, clinical interrogation. She had long ago learned that truth emerged not from cornering a person, but from gently coaxing the soul into betraying itself. And so, instead of summoning the suspects one by one to some cold drawing-room for questioning, she invited them to tea. She chose a Sunday afternoon. The vicarage parlour, always tidy, was made particularly warm and inviting. A fire burned low in the hearth, a silver tea service gleamed, and the smell of fresh scones and apricot jam hung in the air. Miss Marple believed people revealed their truest selves over small, seemingly harmless comforts. She invited them all, Judith, Lorna, and Teddy, under the pretext of easing the strain of recent days. But in truth, she was preparing a trap built not with accusations or alibis, but with memory, manners, and the weight of forgotten things. Teddy arrived first, fashionably disheveled in his tweed coat, the scent of pipe smoke clinging to him like a familiar friend. Lorna followed 10 minutes later, wearing a dark velvet dress far too elegant for the modest vicarage, perhaps a performance of grief or guilt, Miss Marple mused. Judith came last, dignified and distant, her smile forced, her eyes scanning the room like a soldier expecting an ambush. Miss Marple served tea herself, her movements practiced, precise. She made idle conversation at first, speaking of the weather, the troubles with the new organist, and the perils of black market marmalade. Slowly, the conversation turned to more delicate matters. "Do you know," she said, stirring her tea slowly, "I've always found memories to be the most unreliable of things, especially when they involve grief, or inheritance." Judith flinched, almost imperceptibly. Teddy leaned forward, his grin crooked. "Are you suggesting one of us has a faulty memory, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I wouldn't dream of suggesting," she said mildly, only observing. "For instance, I was reminded recently of poor Clarence Harrowby, quite a dashing man by all accounts. Do you remember him, Mr. Harrowby?" Teddy's teacup halted mid-air. No," he said too quickly. "I was just a child when he passed." "Ah, yes. But children remember more than we think, don't they? Especially if they witness something unpleasant." Lorna's hand trembled as she buttered a scone. Miss Marple watched them both. Then she executed the part of her plan that had been forming in her mind since she uncovered the old parish record. From a stack beside the tea tray, she retrieved a folded paper, deliberately aged, and set it gently on the tablecloth. "I came across this yesterday," she said with feigned innocence. "It's an old letter, supposedly written by Clarence before he died. He names a beneficiary in the event of his death, though the ink has faded rather badly." Teddy's face paled. Judith's eyes locked on the letter, though she made no move to touch it. Lorna, strangely, looked away entirely. "I must say," Miss Marple continued, "it's fascinating how names echo across generations. Fortunes shift. Some people gain, others are quietly written out." "Is it authentic?" Teddy asked, his voice tight. "Oh, I haven't had it examined yet," she replied breezily. "But it would be most interesting if it named someone unexpected. Someone who might stand to lose if the truth came out." The room held its breath, And then Lorna spoke. "If this is some sort of test, Miss Marple, it's quite distasteful," she said sharply. "You invite us for tea only to dredge up ghosts." "Ghosts tend to linger," Miss Marple replied, watching her closely, "especially when they've been poorly buried." Teddy stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I think this has gone quite far enough." "Sit down, Mr. Harrowby," came a voice from the doorway. It was Inspector Craddock. He stepped into the room holding a slender envelope, one of the few remaining pieces of Philip Arlingham's correspondence. "We found this in the lining of the late Major's desk drawer, hidden quite deliberately." He handed it to Miss Marple, who unfolded it without comment and read aloud. "Should anything happen to me, look to the accounts from 1919. Clarence's death was no accident. I've kept copies in the safe behind the oak panel. I've trusted too many people. The past is not buried, it's biding its time." Silence again. Judith looked stunned. Lorna's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Teddy, for once, had nothing smug to say. Craddock fixed Teddy with a long look. "You knew something about Clarence's death, didn't you? Something your mother never told anyone." Teddy opened his mouth, but faltered. Miss Marple said gently, "It's not the lie that traps people. It's the pride that insists on maintaining it. That letter on the table, a fabrication. I made it myself from an old envelope and vinegar tea stains." Lorna looked up, her eyes wide. "But your reactions told me everything I needed to know. Mr. Harrowby, you weren't just worried about your inheritance. You feared exposure. That your father's death, your real father, was part of something deeper. That perhaps your mother or your stepfather had made certain arrangements." "I never said that." "You didn't need to," she said softly. "But it wasn't you who killed Philip Arlingham, was it?" Teddy looked stunned. She turned to Lorna. "It was you." Lorna froze. Judith's face went white. Miss Marple continued. "You knew Philip's secrets. You found them long before we did. During your meticulous study of the estate, you knew about Clarence, and you knew that if Philip died, you and Teddy would inherit together. But if the truth of Clarence's business came out, if the fortune were tainted by scandal, you'd lose everything, so you silenced him a second time." Lorna's voice cracked. "You have no proof." "Not yet," Miss Marple admitted. "But I believe we will find the poison bottle, and more importantly, your fingerprints on the safe behind the oak panel, the one Philip tried to protect. You weren't just silencing him, you were erasing a trail that led to your mother's guilt." Judith gasped. "My guilt? You think I—" "No," Miss Marple said. "But Lorna did, and fear makes monsters of us all." For a moment, the room was held in fragile stillness. Then Craddock moved forward, quietly placing a hand on Lorna's shoulder. Her tears came then, not sobs of sorrow, but of rage and defeat. Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea. "Some crimes," she said gently, "are born not from greed, but from the desperate desire to preserve a lie, even if it means burying the truth with the dead." The next morning, the village of Little Dithering awoke to the quiet patter of rain and the even quieter hum of whispered speculation. The news of Lorna's arrest had traveled faster than the milk delivery, and yet, despite the apparent resolution, Miss Marple felt no satisfaction, only a tightening unease. She sat in her garden with her knitting in her lap and a question in her mind. Why now? Why had Lorna acted with such desperation only days before the old secrets were to be revealed anyway? Unless someone else had forced her hand. Someone who stood more to gain or more to lose. It was then that Constable Ferris arrived, breathless and pale. "Miss Marple, it's the safe. The one behind the oak panel in the manor. It's been emptied." Miss Marple rose without a word. The rain, still light, began to darken the edges of her sleeves as she followed Ferris up the lane. At Arlingham Manor, The scene was chaos wrapped in silence. The safe door hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inspector Craddock stood in front of it, arms folded, eyes sharp with anger. "Gone," he said without turning. "Everything. Philip Arlingham's files, his war records, the personal journals, even the original letter referencing Clarence Harrowby's death. Gone." Miss Marple stepped forward slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. She knelt by the safe's threshold and reached inside. Only a small scrap remained, a torn corner of yellowed paper with 2 words written in Philip's hand. "'Cause, she lied." She straightened with a sigh. "This was no common theft," she murmured. "This was a burial." Craddock's voice was low. Someone had access to this house. Someone clever enough to override both the mechanical lock and the new electric one. "That narrows our list, yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Very much." Craddock looked at her. "You don't believe Lorna did this?" "If she had," Miss Marple replied, "she would have destroyed the evidence long before we found the safe. No, this was an act of panic, but not hers. Someone else knew what that safe contained, and they waited until she was in custody. That person is still out there, trying to shape the ending." As if on cue, Judith Arlingham arrived at the manor, flanked by her solicitor. Her eyes were red, but her composure was intact. "I came to collect a few things," she said to Craddock. "My husband's belongings. I assumed the investigation was over." Craddock didn't answer. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Judith, my dear, did you ever know what your husband kept in that safe?" Judith met her gaze, unreadable. "Only what he chose to show me. Some old war records, family deeds. He said it was better not to stir the past. Yet someone has stirred it quite violently," said Miss Marple, "and then tried to seal it again." Craddock gestured for Ferris to escort Judith to another room. When they were gone, he turned to Miss Marple. "What are you thinking?" She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she walked the hall, her fingers brushing the wainscoting, the paintings. This house had secrets, not just in its safes and studies, but in its very walls. "I'm thinking," she said finally, "that we've been asking the wrong questions. We've been wondering who killed Philip, but we should have been wondering why he was killed now." Craddock frowned. "You think his death was timed?" "I do. And I think whoever destroyed that evidence believed the rest of us were getting too close. They needed to buy time, or silence, or both." As they left the manor, the wind picked up. Rain blurred the hedgerows and the sky darkened unnaturally, as though mirroring the gloom of Miss Marple's thoughts. Trust, she realized, was no longer a luxury they could afford. If the killer was still among them, and she was increasingly certain of it, they would strike again. Not out of passion, but out of necessity. That night, Miss Marple stayed up late in her study, poring over every scrap of information she'd collected. A note here, a hesitation there, reactions at tea, inconsistencies in testimony, and something else, a subtle thread she'd noticed but hadn't yet tugged on. The solicitor. Judith's solicitor had appeared far too promptly. He had known what to collect, what to say, and he had keys. She rose, lit only by lamplight, and penned a letter to Inspector Craddock. Then she returned to the fireplace and removed a small, soot-darkened envelope she'd hidden days earlier. Inside it was a single sheet of paper. It had been in Philip Arlingham's study, wedged behind a bookshelf panel, forgotten or perhaps left as a final precaution. The ink was faded, but legible. "If I am found dead, it will not be illness. Look to those who inherit. Look to those who call the past inconvenient. The truth is in the will, but not the one in the safe." She stared at the letter. The truth was not in the destroyed will, it was elsewhere, and if the killer hadn't found it yet, they would come again. She had to act before they did. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the church. It was quiet, the pews empty. She found the vicar dusting hymnals. "Reverend," she said, "do you still keep parish copies of significant family documents? Wills, letters of probate?" The vicar looked surprised. Yes, we do. For historical purposes. Why do you—" "Would you be so kind as to let me review the Arlingham file?" He hesitated only a moment before leading her to the old records room. Miss Marple scanned the dusty boxes, found the one marked Arlingham, 1910 to present, and opened it with steady hands. There, folded beneath a baptismal certificate and a yellowed wedding license, was the original copy of Philip Arlingham's final will, filed quietly with the church 2 weeks before his death. Her eyes scanned the clauses, and then she saw it. The entire estate. Not to Judith, not to Teddy, not even to Lorna, but to someone no one had considered, someone who had no idea. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. The motive had never been greed alone. It had been fear of exposure, of shame, of legacy rewritten. And now the killer had tried to erase it all. But the past never vanishes so easily, and the final move had yet to be played. Miss Marple stood at the threshold of St. Eustace's vestry, the church's ancient stone walls holding their breath around her. She clutched the discovered will with gloved fingers, its significance pressing on her like a storm cloud heavy with unfallen rain. The truth had a name now, one the killer had fought desperately to keep hidden. She returned to her cottage with cautious haste, eyes alert to every hedgerow and parked car. The envelope was sealed and addressed to Inspector Craddock, its contents enough to shatter the fragile story the authorities had accepted. She had only just lit the lamp on her writing desk when a sharp knock startled her. Standing in the doorway was young Tom Herrick. The delivery boy, the errand runner, the boy who everyone forgot was in the room. His face was pale, and his eyes darted behind him like a rabbit expecting hounds. "Miss Marple, you've got to come. It's Lorna." She didn't ask questions. She simply grabbed her coat and followed. They cut through the back lanes and crossed the dew-drenched village green. The old constable's station was eerily quiet. Tom led her to the back, through the side entrance meant for kitchen deliveries, and down a short corridor to the holding cell. The iron-barred door stood open. The cell was empty, but not just empty. Ransacked. The small cot had been overturned, the pillow shredded. A pool of crimson stained the otherwise spotless stone floor. On the wall, written in smeared blood or something dark and wet like ink, were 2 chilling words. Too late. Tom stepped back, gagging. Miss Marple felt the dread settle in her chest, slow and cold. Inspector Craddock arrived 5 minutes later. His face went hard at the sight, and he barked orders with uncharacteristic venom. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "She was under guard. Only Constable Ferris had the keys." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Then we must ask where Ferris is." But Ferris was nowhere to be found. They searched the grounds and surrounding streets. His patrol bicycle was still propped against the station's side wall, its tires slick with morning mist. In the alley, they found his hat, crumpled and damp. A smear of blood trailed from the bricks to the storm drain and vanished. Lorna had not escaped. She had been taken. By whom and for what end remained the question, but it was no longer just a murder investigation. Now it was a race against time. Craddock organized search parties, cordoned off roads, and questioned the few early risers who might have seen anything. But Miss Marple moved in another direction entirely. She returned to the manor. Judith Arlingham answered the door, eyes hollow, voice strained. She didn't argue when Miss Marple asked to speak with Teddy. In the boy's study, books were neatly aligned. His violin rested on a polished stand, and a half-finished chessboard sat undisturbed. But Miss Marple wasn't looking for signs of a child. She was looking for influence, and she found it, tucked in the corner of his bookshelf. Memoirs of Captain Clarence Harrowby. The name struck her, the man Philip had referenced in his final notes. The same Clarence whose suspicious wartime death had never been fully investigated. The book bore an inscription, "To Philip, brothers beyond blood. May the truth never divide us." CH double quote. Miss Marple's breath caught. She opened the memoir. Pages had been marked, underlined in pencil. Certain names, certain villages, circled with care. One of them was Villeneuve-les-Bois, the site of a notorious intelligence betrayal in 1944. This wasn't a boy's curiosity. This was an investigation of his own. She turned to Judith slowly. "Did your husband ever speak of Captain Harrowby?" Judith's eyes flickered. "Only rarely. He said Clarence saved his life in France, but that he had to leave something behind. He never told me what." Miss Marple nodded. "He left the truth behind, and someone's been trying very hard to ensure it stays buried." As they spoke, a constable burst through the manor's front door. His face was pale as paper. "They've found Ferris," he said breathlessly. "In the woods near Harlow's copse. He's alive, but barely." Miss Marple and Craddock met at the hospital an hour later. Ferris, bloodied and delirious, whispered only one thing before passing out from painkillers. Wrong one. It was meant for her. A chill coiled in Miss Marple's gut. It hadn't been about silencing Lorna. It had been about baiting her. The detective, whoever was behind this, had wanted her off balance, or worse, removed entirely. They knew she was close. That night, Miss Marple sat in her parlor beside a softly crackling fire. The rain had returned, light but constant, tapping at the windows like insistent fingers. Her mind traced every thread, every motive, every false confession, every misstep. It all came back to the will. The version in the safe had been forged, destroyed when its purpose was complete. But the version in the church, Philip's real intent, named Teddy Arlingham not just as heir, but as the biological child of Clarence Harrowby, not Philip. A scandal, one hidden for decades. A secret held by a small handful, among them Philip, and someone who'd kill to keep it silent. Someone who couldn't afford the truth to come out because it would destroy their legacy or expose their crimes. Miss Marple rose. She no longer needed to guess. She knew who had taken Lorna, and she knew where they'd gone. The final act was approaching, and if she moved carefully, she could bring it to light before the curtain fell for good. But the villain wasn't just trying to escape justice now. They were trying to erase it. Forever. The wind had shifted. Not just outside, where the clouds had begun to clear and the silver dawn crept over St. Eustace's spire, but inside Miss Marple's mind, where all the noise and contradiction of the case had begun to settle into something like a rhythm. She stood at the edge of Harlow's copse, the place where Constable Ferris had been found. Broken, bleeding, but alive. The forest was still damp with morning rain. Footprints, half-washed, erratic, led in confusing loops around a thicket of blackthorn. But there was something odd, something that pulled at her memory like a loose thread. She knelt. Near the base of a gnarled root was a small metal object. Weathered brass, the kind used in old fountain pens. But this wasn't from a pen. It was the tip of a violin bow. Her eyes narrowed. Teddy. The boy's violin had been a fixture in every room he occupied, always neatly stored, always present. But he hadn't played at the memorial. Not even when Judith had softly encouraged him. He had simply said he didn't feel like it. Grief, presumably. But Miss Marple remembered the way his mother had paused. Just briefly. A subtle hesitation, a flicker of worry, quickly concealed. Back at the manor, Miss Marple asked to see the violin. Judith brought it down without question, its polished cherry wood still shining. But when Miss Marple took it gently in her hands, Her suspicion was confirmed. The bow had been replaced, newer, unworn. The grain didn't match. She examined the case more closely. In the lining, almost too small to notice, was a faint reddish stain. Blood. It was Teddy's bow, not Lorna's captor's, that had been found at the crime scene. And if Teddy had been there, why? She didn't confront Judith. Not yet. Not without proof. Instead, she asked about the boy's schedule, where he might be now. Judith hesitated again. He's probably at the old gardener's shed. He likes to go there when he needs quiet. Miss Marple nodded, thanked her, and made her way toward the back gardens. The shed had been part of the estate for decades, unused since the groundskeeper retired. Ivy choked its walls, and the lock had long since rusted away. Inside, the air was musty, but faint sounds echoed from deeper within. A shuffling, a soft whimper. She stepped inside. Lorna was there, gagged, bound, frightened but alive. And beside her, sitting cross-legged on the floor, so was Teddy Arlingham. He looked up calmly. "I knew you'd come," he said. There was no menace in his voice, only certainty. Miss Marple didn't move. "You brought her here," he nodded. "She was going to ruin everything. My mother didn't want me to know. About Clarence, about the will, but I saw the letters, the photo, the initials on the back." Miss Marple's heart sank. Clarence Harrowby, Philip's dearest friend, had fathered the child. The inheritance, the title, the estate. None of it had ever belonged to Teddy in the eyes of those who valued legitimacy. "She lied to me," he said quietly. "All my life. I thought Philip was my father. I worshipped him." "And he loved you," Miss Marple said gently, "whether by blood or not." Teddy's hands were clenched in his lap. "Lorna found the will. She said she'd show it to the police. Said everything would change. She didn't care what it meant for Mother. For me." "So you tried to silence her?" Miss Marple said. "No," he snapped. "I just wanted to frighten her, make her go away. I didn't hit Ferris. That was someone else. Someone followed me." Her brow furrowed. "Who?" He hesitated. Then, almost in a whisper, "Mr. Bletchley, the Manor's solicitor. The quiet, observant man who had overseen Philip's affairs, handled the estate, and read the false will aloud with such solemn gravity. He told me the truth," Teddy said. "Said we could fix it, that no one had to know." Miss Marple's breath caught. Bletchley. She remembered now. At the reading of the will, he had made a passing remark that had seemed odd at the time. Something about the need for clarity in legacy. And later, during the search, he had shown up just after they found the false will, almost as if he knew it had been discovered. A solicitor who handled the documents, who had access to the real will, and the motive to forge another. A man who stood to lose everything if the scandal came to light, his reputation, his standing, perhaps even blackmail leverage built up over the years. She left Lorna in the shed with Teddy, who made no move to run. He seemed tired, spent. Back at the village, she found Inspector Craddock and relayed what she'd learned. Craddock's face turned grim. "I'll put out an alert for Bletchley immediately." But they didn't have to look far. Bletchley arrived at the station not an hour later, calm, composed, and wearing his best overcoat. He carried a briefcase. Inside was a stack of burned documents, still warm. Among the ashes, forensic experts later confirmed, were pieces of the original will, along with photographs of Clarence Harrowby and Judith Arlingham during the war. Love letters, affidavits, proof. When confronted, Bletchley's mask cracked only slightly. He denied involvement in Ferris's assault, blamed Teddy's emotional instability, claimed Lorna had manipulated the boy to gain control of the estate, but it was too late. The pattern had emerged, and every thread led back to him. He had forged the will. He had blackmailed Judith for decades. He had panicked when Lorna began to dig. And when Teddy stumbled into the truth, Bletchley had tried to bury it all, first with manipulation, then with violence. Miss Marple watched as he was led away in cuffs. Teddy would be spared prison, though questions would linger. And as for Judith, grief, shame, and perhaps a measure of relief passed across her face as the truth came to light. The burden of silence was lifted, at last. Miss Marple stood in her parlour that evening, pouring herself a quiet cup of tea. Outside, the clouds had scattered, and the stars were blinking through. The pattern had always been there. In a broken violin bar, a child's silence, a misplaced document. The truth, like a fine lacework, had simply required patience and a sharp eye to see. The fog had lifted, literally and figuratively. With Bletchley in custody and the original will recovered from the remnants in his fireplace, it seemed the case was nearly at an end. Lorna was safe. Teddy had been spared the worst. Judith's reputation had withstood the storm, if only barely. The village, as it always did, began to settle back into the rhythm of normality. But Miss Marple did not feel settled. There was a hole in the fabric of the case. Not a loose thread, but a deliberate stitch. One that didn't match. Something too neat. The documents had all pointed to Bletchley. Forged signatures, missing pages, hidden letters. Yet something about his confession rang hollow. He had admitted to altering the will and misleading Judith for years, but he'd denied ordering or executing the attack on Constable Ferris. He'd insisted he hadn't taken Lorna, and he hadn't lied, at least not about that. Because Teddy had taken her. But why? Out of panic, out of fear, so number. There had been something else in his eyes in the shed. Something unnerving in how still he had been. How resigned. She found him where she suspected he'd be, at the grave of Philip Arlingham. The boy sat cross-legged in the grass, back straight, eyes calm. He did not startle when she approached. "I thought you might come," he said. "So you said before," Miss Marple replied gently. "You're very certain about things for someone your age." "I think," he said, "you already know, don't you?" She nodded slowly. "I believe I do, but I want to hear it from you." He was quiet for a long moment. A wind stirred the grass. "I hated Clarence Harrowby," Teddy said at last. "I never met him, but I hated him." Miss Marple sat beside him, resting her cane across her knees. "Because he was your real father?" "No," he whispered, "because he wasn't Philip." That was it. The fracture in the foundation. "All my life," he said, "I knew I wasn't like the others at school. I didn't fit. I tried. I followed rules. I played the violin because it made Mother smile. But I was always outside of things, except with Philip." Teddy's voice softened. "He never made me feel wrong. Even when I made mistakes, he never raised his voice. He said kindness was more important than lineage. I used to hear him say that to guests, even when they mocked me." "And your mother?" Miss Marple asked. "She loved him, but she was afraid of what it would mean if people found out about me, about Clarence. She didn't tell you the truth. Number Y found it myself. One of Bletchley's files, left open by accident. Letters, medical reports, a photo, a man with my eyes." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though her heart ached. "I asked her," Teddy continued. "She denied it, said it didn't matter, but she cried for days, wouldn't look at me, like I reminded her of everything she wanted to forget. So when Lorna found the will, I panicked. If people knew, they'd say I didn't belong, that everything Philip gave me was a lie. Lorna said she was going to publish it, tell the trustees. She didn't mean to be cruel, but she didn't understand what it would do to me. To Mother." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. So you took her, to silence her. I just wanted to talk, to explain, but Ferris came. He must have followed me, and I didn't mean for him to get hurt. Miss Marple waited. She felt the weight of the silence that followed. Then, you knew Bletchley would take the blame. Yes. The confession was chilling in its clarity, not just the actions themselves, but the calculation behind them. Miss Marple stared at the boy, no older than 13, who had outmaneuvered a solicitor, misled his mother, and manipulated the assumptions of every adult around him. You're very clever, Teddy. I learned from Philip. He said I could be anything I wanted if I just listened, if I paid attention. You paid attention to more than people realized. He nodded. Why confess now? She asked quietly. Because you'd find out anyway. You always do. Miss Marple looked back toward the village, where the church bells were starting to chime. You know, she said, most people would have done anything to keep the truth buried. They would have destroyed the letters, blamed everything on Bletchley. Let the lie stand. I almost did, Teddy replied. And what changed your mind? He looked toward the grave. He would have been ashamed of me. There was silence again. Deeper now, not because of guilt, but because the mask had finally slipped. You didn't do this for your mother, Miss Marple said. Not really, not even for yourself. Teddy looked at her, eyes glassy but dry. I did it to protect his legacy, because I didn't want to stop being his son. It was a motive that went beyond greed or fear. It was identity. It was love, twisted, misdirected, and desperate. You're not a monster, Teddy, she said quietly. But you need help and consequences, not just for Lorna and Ferris, but for yourself. He nodded. Not with fear, but with a strange adult calm. I understand. Later, when she spoke with Inspector Craddock, the full picture emerged. Bletchley had forged the will, yes, and blackmailed Judith, but the most dangerous player in the game had been a child determined to preserve the only love he'd ever known. His actions were criminal, but they were also the byproduct of secrets, neglect, and emotional abandonment. It shook the village in ways no ordinary scandal could. Not because of the money, not even because of the violence, but because a child had believed he had to lie to exist. Miss Marple sat in her parlor that night with a letter from Judith. It was short, raw. She wrote of how she had tried to protect Teddy by hiding the truth, never realizing that truth was precisely what he needed. I never knew how lonely he was, she wrote, and now I wonder if I ever really saw him at all. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it beside her knitting. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the windows. She had solved the crime, yes, exposed the forgeries, uncovered the manipulations. But what lingered was not the guilt or even the cleverness of it all. It was the quiet heartbreak of a boy who had gone too far, because no one ever told him he was enough. The storm had broken. Not just in the sky, where thunder rolled over the hills like cannon fire, but in St. Hedwig's itself, where secrets, lies, and grief had finally boiled over. For Miss Marple, the journey had been long and bitter. Every truth uncovered seemed to unearth 2 more lies. But now, finally, the path ahead was clear, and at the end of that path stood Judith Arlingham. The truth had not come gently. It never did, when love was tangled with guilt. She had not forged the will, nor had she ordered the attack on Constable Ferris. But she had done something far worse. In her own eyes, she had known that Philip wasn't Teddy's father, known that the inheritance he left had been built on a lie, and known, somewhere deep down, that her silence was not protection, but cowardice. Now her silence had left scars on everyone she loved. She stood alone in the drawing room, her back to Miss Marple, staring out into the storm-lit night. The rain danced against the tall windows, casting streaks of silver across her shoulders. "I imagine you've come to arrest me," Judith said softly. "No," Miss Marple replied. "That is not my place." Judith turned, her face pale but composed. "Then why?" "Because it isn't over." Judith's lips trembled. "What more do you want from me?" "The truth, all of it. Not just what you've told the inspector. Not what you told Bletchley. What you told yourself." Judith swallowed hard. "Teddy didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," she said. "He panicked. He was trying to protect himself," Miss Marple said gently. "And you, and a ghost. But mostly, the version of his life he believed in." Judith stepped back, her voice rising. "He's a child, Jane." "No," Miss Marple said. "He's not. Not anymore. Not after what he's done." Judith turned away again. Lightning forked across the sky. "I wanted to tell him the truth, I did. But every time I looked into his eyes, he had Philip's eyes, not Clarence's. And I thought if I just loved him enough." "You wouldn't have to tell him," Miss Marple finished. Silence. Then Judith laughed bitterly. "I destroyed my own son to protect him." "No," Miss Marple said. "You let someone else do it for you." Judith flinched. Miss Marple took a few steps forward, her cane clicking softly on the parquet. "You didn't hurt Ferris. You didn't lock Lorna in a shed. You didn't forge the will, but you saw what Teddy was becoming. You saw how obsessed he was, how withdrawn. You knew Bletchley was manipulating you, and yet you said nothing." "I couldn't lose him," Judith whispered. "You were losing him long before this. Every time you lied." Thunder cracked again, shaking the windows. Judith turned, fury blooming in her face. "And what would you have done, Jane?" "Told the whole village. Let the Arlingham name be dragged through the mud. Let them spit on Philip's grave." Miss Marple's voice was soft, but unyielding. "Yes." Judith stared, horrified. "Because the name doesn't matter. Philip's goodness, his honor, was never in his blood. It was in his actions, and that's what Teddy should have been taught. That it's not who you're born to, it's who you choose to be." Tears welled in Judith's eyes. "I failed him," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but it isn't too late to fix it." There was a knock at the door. Slow. Measured. Judith froze. Miss Marple moved to open it. On the threshold stood Teddy. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his shoes muddy from the storm. But his eyes, they were dry and resolute. Judith stared at him, trembling. "Teddy." He didn't speak. He walked into the room, the storm swirling behind him like a ghost. In his hands, he held something wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the table and unwrapped it carefully. The missing second will. The real one. Signed, dated, witnessed by Philip himself. Judith gasped. "I took it," Teddy said, "before the solicitor arrived. I'd found it weeks ago, hidden behind the false panel in Philip's study drawer." "Why?" she whispered. "Because I didn't want the truth to matter," he said. "I wanted to be his son, no matter what." "Teddy." Judith took a step forward. He held up a hand. "I thought I was being strong, like he would have been, but I hurt people, and I lied. I thought I was saving us, but I was just hiding." His voice cracked. "I'm ready to confess." Miss Marple moved between them, her voice quiet but firm. "Before you do, there's something else you need to know." Both mother and son looked to her. Miss Marple retrieved a letter from her bag. She placed it beside the will. "It's from Philip, to Judith, dated 2 days before his death. He knew the truth." Judith's breath hitched. "He knew." "He always knew," Miss Marple said. "And he forgave you. He never mentioned Clarence. He only spoke of the boy he loved, the son he raised. This letter was meant for you to read after his funeral. But Bletchley stole it, hid it. He wanted you to believe that Philip would never have accepted the truth. Teddy picked up the letter, hands shaking. Judith's face crumpled. I lied to him, she sobbed, and he still loved me. He always did, Miss Marple said gently. There was a long silence. Then Teddy turned to his mother. I'll go with the inspector. I have to. Judith nodded through tears. I'll be right behind you. The days that followed were heavy with pain, but also healing. Teddy's confession was taken in full. The charges were serious, but mitigated by his age, his confession, and the emotional manipulation he'd suffered at Bletchley's hands. With Miss Marple's testimony and the discovery of the second will, much was put right. But some things, Miss Marple knew, could never be restored. Not fully. Still, in the quiet of her cottage, as the sun finally broke through storm clouds and warmed the garden, she allowed herself a rare smile. The villain had not been a monster. Not this time. Just a frightened child in the shadow of too many lies. And as always, the truth, however painful, had brought light. Even to the darkest corners of St. Hedwig's. The village of St. Hedwig's, now drenched in calm after the storm, had returned to its ordinary rhythms. Church bells chimed softly in the distance. The local bakery reopened. Gossip flowed like tea once more, but with hushed reverence now, cautious not to speak too loudly about the Arlinghams, the will, or the confession. Nathan had taken responsibility, and the case was, by all appearances, closed. Miss Marple was already packing her suitcase. The last of her belongings, knitting needles, a worn copy of Murder in the Cathedral, and her lavender-scented shawl, lay folded on the bed. Outside, the garden hummed in early autumn light. A knock sounded at the door. Not urgent, but deliberate. She opened it to find Inspector Reynolds standing there, holding a file tucked under one arm, his brow creased with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" She stepped aside, gesturing toward the sitting room. "Of course, though I suspect this is not a social call." Reynolds gave a small, tired chuckle. "Always one step ahead, aren't you?" "Not always," she said, settling into her armchair. "But often enough to be inconvenient." He handed her the file. "There's something in there you need to see. We reviewed Bletchley's correspondence, letters, notes, drafts. He was a meticulous record keeper. And something odd turned up." Miss Marple's fingers flipped through the papers. Bank statements, handwritten letters, notes from conversations. Then she stopped. One letter stood out. A message from Philip Arlingham, dated 6 months before his death, addressed to Bletchley himself. "I trust you with my affairs, as you have been with this family since my youth. But let me be clear, under no circumstance is my sister to benefit from my estate. Her entitlement, real or imagined, has expired long ago with her departure from this family." Miss Marple blinked. "Sister," she said aloud. Reynolds leaned forward. "Exactly. We didn't even know he had one. No record in the will. No mention in the family files. Nothing. And yet this letter proves she existed, and that he feared her return." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the page. Her mind buzzed like a disturbed hive. "She didn't return for love or reconciliation," she murmured. "She came for revenge." Reynolds nodded grimly. "We believe she may have orchestrated everything." The pieces clicked swiftly. Vivienne Thorne, the housekeeper hired shortly before Philip's death. Polite, quiet, unremarkable. Too unremarkable. She'd arrived with glowing recommendations, provided by Bletchley, of course, and had blended in effortlessly, avoiding suspicion. Even Miss Marple had barely noticed her presence, always in the background, never offering opinions. But the second will had gone missing while Vivienne was on duty. The letter from Philip had been tucked among Bletchley's effects, not in his office, but in the linen drawer where only housekeeping staff would tidy. Miss Marple's mind flashed to something seemingly trivial. A brief conversation in the kitchen when Vivian had casually asked about Miss Marple's time in Sussex. "I imagine your village has no secrets left," she had said. "How dull it must be when everyone's truth is already known." Not a housekeeper's musing, a manipulator's challenge. Miss Marple and Reynold arrived at the Arlingham estate just past tea. Vivian was polishing the silverware. "How lovely to see you, Miss Marple," she said pleasantly. "I was told you'd already left." "I had intended to," Miss Marple replied. "But as you know, sometimes goodbyes come with loose ends." Vivian smiled. "Don't they always?" Reynold produced the letter. "We found this. Care to explain?" Vivian took it without hesitation, reading the words calmly. Then she looked up, and something behind her eyes shifted. Not fear, amusement. "I wondered when you'd find that," she said. "He always was dramatic, wasn't he?" "You're his sister," Miss Marple said. "Born out of wedlock, perhaps, hidden for reputation's sake. But Philip remembered, and he disinherited you for good reason." "Because I reminded him of Mother," Vivian said, "and what he did to her." There it was. Cold fury, coiled behind a mask of control. "You orchestrated the theft of the will," Miss Marple said. "You planted it where Teddy could find it. You encouraged his doubts, his paranoia. You fed Bletchley just enough to keep him dancing on your string." Vivian's eyes sparkled. "Everyone wants to believe the truth they're most afraid of. It was easy. So very easy." "And what of the letter Philip wrote to Judith?" Miss Marple asked. Vivian gave a small shrug. "I thought about destroying it. But then, it served my purpose better hidden. I wanted Judith to believe she was unloved, that Philip died ashamed of her. She's the reason I was sent away. I just wanted her to feel what I felt." "And Ferris?" "The attack." Vivian's voice hardened. "That wasn't me. That was Teddy. That's the part I never intended. But boys will be boys when they believe they're fighting ghosts." Reynold stepped forward. "You're under arrest, Miss Thorne, if that is your name, for conspiracy to manipulate a legal estate and obstruction of justice. Anything you say." But Vivian was already untying her apron, hands calm, eyes gleaming. "You have no idea how long I've waited for someone to notice," she said. "It's been dreadfully boring, pretending to be harmless." Later, as the police car disappeared down the winding road, Miss Marple stood in the garden, breathing in the scent of lavender and rain. Reynold joined her. "She almost got away with it." Miss Marple nodded. "Almost, but malice has a way of leaving fingerprints on the soul, and cleverness never quite hides the pride behind it. She did all this. For what? Spite? Inheritance? No," Miss Marple said softly. "For acknowledgement. To make the family remember what they erased. To remind them she had once existed." Reynold exhaled. "Hell of a price to pay." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes," she said, "but the past always collects its debts, sooner or later." And with that final knot untangled, the case of the Arlingham will finally, truly, came to an end. Though in Miss Marple's experience, no mystery ever ended entirely, only paused, waiting for the next voice, whispering through the curtains of deception. The trial was brief, too brief, some whispered in the drawing rooms of St. Hedwig's, behind veils of polite concern and porcelain teacups. Vivian Thorne, born Lillian Arlingham, was charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and the manipulation of legal documents related to the forged Arlingham will. The press feasted on the case. "Heiress of vengeance," the headlines called her. But it was Miss Jane Marple who received the quiet nods in the village, a woman who had once again seen the truth buried beneath layers of illusion. Vivian did not resist the verdict. She accepted her sentencing with a composed smile, as if winning had never required escape, only remembrance. Still, there were doubts, questions, and that's why, on a cool October evening after the trial, the townsfolk gathered once more at the vicar's hall. They came not for tea or hymn practice, but for clarity, for understanding. Miss Marple, ever modest, agreed to speak. She stood before them in her pale blue cardigan, her hands folded gently in front of her. "I don't usually take to giving lectures," she began. "But since we've all had our lives turned about like socks in a drawer, I thought perhaps you'd like to know how it all truly happened." A hush fell over the room. "It all started, of course, with the death of Philip Arlingham," she said. "A seemingly simple heart attack. But death, like life, is never as simple as it appears." She paced slowly. The first clue was not what was present, but what was missing. The second, Will People nodded. Everyone remembered how it had vanished, and how young Teddy had suddenly become heir by default. "But wills do not simply vanish," she said, "nor do they change hands unnoticed in an old estate with few visitors and even fewer secrets." She turned to the crowd. "Only someone trusted, someone overlooked, like a housekeeper, could have removed it unnoticed." Murmurs rose. Still, theft was not enough. Vivian, or Lillian, had to build a story around it, one that would draw suspicion to Judith, Bletchley, and even young Teddy. Each had motive, each had secrets, but only one person had all the knowledge required to twist them. She paused. Miss Thorne created a storm and then hid behind the shutters. She planted evidence, repositioned letters, whispered doubts into the ears of a confused boy, and ensured the solicitor, Bletchley, would not get too close to the truth. A man in the back raised a hand. But if she did all that, why didn't she just forge a will in her own name? Miss Marple smiled gently. She didn't want the inheritance. She wanted to ruin the Arlinghams, to erase them as they had erased her. Remember, Philip's letter was clear. He did not consider her family. So she dismantled his legacy, one thread at a time. She made sure the wrong heir would rise, that guilt would poison the family from within. The money was never her goal. Recognition was. Another voice piped up. Inspector Reynold, standing quietly near the fireplace. She nearly succeeded. If Miss Marple hadn't spotted the inconsistency in the linen drawer, that Bletchley would never have hidden correspondence among bed sheets, we'd have assumed he destroyed the second will. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. It was an odd place, wasn't it? But only someone tending linens, Vivian, would think to use it. That was the thread I pulled. From there it all unraveled. "But what of Teddy?" someone asked. "He believed he was defending the family, even attacked Ferris over it." "He was a pawn," Miss Marple said, her tone softening. "A foolish boy, but not malicious. Vivian played on his insecurities, his belief that he was never truly accepted. He lashed out, but it was grief and fear that fueled him." "And Ferris?" the vicar asked. "Will he recover?" "He already has," Reynold said, "and he's taken up teaching again. Quiet man. Resilient." For a moment, silence filled the hall. Then a woman near the front asked the question that had lingered in every conversation since the trial. "Do you believe justice was done?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She walked slowly to the window and looked out into the dusk, where crows gathered on bare branches and mist rolled gently across the grass. "I believe," she said at last, "that justice wears many faces. The law has done its part. Vivian is behind bars. The estate will be rightfully distributed. The wounds are healing." She turned back to them. "But the past has not released its grip, and I suspect it never will." There was something wistful in her voice. Something deeper. "The truth is," she said quietly, "we uncovered a villain, but we also uncovered why she became one. Neglect, cruelty, erasure, those are powerful forces. She was not born with malice in her heart. It was planted, watered, grown in the dark." Reynolds crossed his arms. "Still doesn't excuse it." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it explains it, and perhaps that is the real justice. To know, to understand." She took her seat, and the gathering slowly began to dissolve into murmurs and reflections. People filed out into the chilly evening, their breath misting as they walked home through the quiet lanes of St. Hedwig's. Later that night, as Miss Marple returned to her small rented cottage, she paused at her writing desk. A single letter sat unopened. It bore no stamp, no signature. She opened it. Inside was a single line, written in a familiar, crisp hand. "You were always cleverer than I gave you credit for. I'll remember that next time. L." Miss Marple folded the note slowly. She stared at it for a long while, then placed it into a small wooden box filled with oddities and unresolved threads from other cases. She locked it. No fingerprints, no return address. Just a final echo of a mind that had not yet finished its game. Justice had been served. For now. But the shadow had not disappeared. It had simply stepped aside, waiting for the next opportunity, and Miss Marple, now more than ever, remained watchful. For mysteries never end. They only change shape. The mist rolled back across St. Hedwig's, shrouding the village once more in its early autumn hush. The trial was over. Vivian Thorne, once Lillian Arlingham, was behind bars, and the Arlingham estate had been returned to its rightful heir, Judith. It should have been the end. The last of the questions answered, the final threads tied off. But Miss Marple, seated on the train departing the village, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, was not entirely at peace. She had learned long ago that mystery is like ivy. It may appear trimmed back, but roots always remain, and one particular root still itched at her mind. The train gave a soft whistle as it passed the edge of the woods surrounding the Arlingham estate. Miss Marple glanced out the window as the gnarled trees slipped past in shadowed procession. It was then she remembered something odd. Not grand, not glaring, just wrong. During the investigation, she'd reviewed countless household records. She recalled Ferris's handwritten log of staff inventories, precise, meticulous, almost obsessive in its order. But one thing had caught her eye and been discarded as irrelevant at the time. Cigarette case, gold, initials J.H., turned into the housekeeper 3 days after Mr. Arlingham's death. She had assumed it belonged to a guest or a servant, easily explained, but then she sat upright. The initials. J.H. There had been no guest or family member with those initials in the current household, and Ferris had not smoked, nor had Philip Arlingham, not in over a decade. So who had left it? And more importantly, why was it never claimed? Back in London the next day, Miss Marple placed a quiet call to Inspector Reynolds. "Would you be a dear and check something for me?" she asked, as if requesting a scone recipe. She recited the inventory note and the initials. There was a pause. "I'll see if it's still in evidence," Reynolds said. But when he rang back hours later, his tone was different. "It's gone, logged, sealed, but no longer in storage. Signed out, under my name." There was silence. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but firm. "You didn't request it, did you?" "Number. But someone knew your eyes would eventually drift to it." The case had always seemed personal, crafted with surgical precision, its villains seemingly satisfied to destroy the Arlinghams without escaping with a penny. But what if Vivian Thorne wasn't alone? What if someone had quietly orchestrated parts of the crime from the shadows, then erased their footprints while she bore the weight of public judgment? Someone who had access to police records. Someone clever enough to make the trap seem complete. Later that week, a letter arrived for Miss Marple at her Chelsea flat. No envelope. Just a single folded sheet, slipped through the mail slot. Written in elegant, looping script. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, Miss Marple. You found the heart of the tale, but not the architect. Not everything buried should be unearthed. Until next time, J.H. She stared at it in the amber light of her parlor lamp. A warning, a confession, or an invitation? She'd long suspected the real villain might not be Vivian, but someone with access to more than just old grudges. Someone with means, method, and an eye for theatricality. Vivian had orchestrated the collapse, but perhaps not the design. Who, then, was J.H., a jilted associate? A family member long erased from records? A former lover of Philip's? The deeper she thought, the more questions bloomed. Had she missed a guest on the registry? A name concealed under a pseudonym? Her mind went back to the portraits that lined the Arlingham Hall, faces long dead, some unmarked. One in particular, a gentleman in naval uniform, the nameplate faded with time. Judith had said the name once. Jonas Heathersley, a distant cousin who had vanished decades ago in scandal. Could it be him, alive, watching? Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face remained calm. Mystery, she thought, was not an enemy to be vanquished. It was a companion, a clever, whispering companion that never truly left your side. Days passed. She returned to her routines. Tea at 4:15, letters replied to with care, her roses trimmed just so. The world resumed its quiet rhythm, but beneath it the note remained, filed not under case closed, but in a fresh folder marked only with a question mark. Then one evening, as she walked back from the library, a woman approached her, young, pale, grey scarf tucked beneath a trench coat. She looked lost, but her eyes were sharp. "Miss Marple?" she asked softly. "Yes? I was told you were the only one who could help me. I think my brother is missing, but no one believes me. They say he never existed." Miss Marple studied her for a moment. There was desperation in her voice, but not madness. "What is your brother's name?" The woman hesitated. "Henry Jonas." Miss Marple's heart skipped, a reversal of the initials. She smiled gently. "Come in, dear. Let's have tea and you can tell me everything." Outside, the mist began to gather once more, and somewhere, in the vast tangle of unseen threads that stretched from St. Hedwig's to London and back again, a hand turned the page of a journal and wrote, "Game reset." She's still watching. Good. That makes it more fun.